Hello everyone, it's time for another semi-tutorial, showing you the progress I've made video. So let's hop right in. As you can see here, I implemented a text box for the game that triggers when you press the return button while you are in certain areas. For example, right here you get this message, but if I go over here you get another one. And this text box feature includes stuff like you have different character names, like here you have nobody and up there you have somebody. You have different portraits and you have different text. And once you leave the area, you don't even have to press return again. The text box will fade out. And as well as when you trigger the text box, then it will fade in. So yeah, that's what I want to show you today, how you can do that yourself. And for that, I've made a new scene called Textbox, aptly named. And the text box consists of these 4 elements here, as well as obviously a parent node, just so you have an easier way to position everything. And also you need a parent node obviously when you have a scene in Godot, because Godot relies on scenes having these sort of root nodes. So yeah. So the first thing is obviously the background image, which is the text box right here. I decided to go with normal sprite nodes for this. There is also the option of using texture rect, which is a control node, so it would, as you can see, it has the same coloring as the labels. So this is what you should use according to Godot for UI. But I don't really see the point at the moment. Supposedly it is better for rearranging stuff when you have complex UI, so that it is always evenly spaced or spaced in a way that you have when you have 3 objects that they have the same space between each other. Supposedly it's good for that, but this is a very simple UI element. And I found the UI controls of Godot quite confusing and hard to use in a way. So I decided, let's go with that, and it works, so yeah. So again, just normal sprites here, a text box sprite, so this is the background image basically. Then we have portrait sprite, that is this rectangle right here. I have 2 different textures for that, this and that one. And we have labels. These are actually part of the UI control nodes. And I find them quite useful, because not only do you have the option to assign your own font in here. If you go into custom fonts, you can select a new dynamic font, and when you go into the newly created dynamic font, we have this font data here, and there you can put your TTF or whatever font file you have, and up here you can decide what font size you want to use for that dynamic font, And yeah, that is working quite well. Now, something that I noticed is that you should probably save this dynamic font as a resource. So this whole thing here by, I think it's right here, this button. Because I noticed a strange bug when you go to the oh, I'm actually in the wrong directory. So you should save the dynamic font, this thing here. This is what you should save. Because I noticed a strange bug that if you want to change the font data afterwards, it would update in the editor, but it didn't update when I started the game. So in the game there was still the old font data when I changed that one, and that was really weird. So do yourself a favor and save your dynamic font data as different fonts, as I done so here. These are different fonts, and just assign these fonts once you have them to your font right here, instead of always creating new ones. It also helps in terms of keeping everything consistent in a way. So yeah, that's so much for the fonts. You can, of course, recolor them if you want. For that, you can just go to your label and go under custom colors. You can change the font color, and you can add optionally a font shadow to that. If you do so, you should also click under custom constants, because there is this option shadow as outline, or shadow, what is that? Shadow offset Y. These will be useful to you if you want to have a shadow and want to customize that positioning of that shadow also. So yeah. Is there something else I should mention in terms of the labels? Oh yes, there's one very important thing that I'm really glad about that it is in here. As you can see, there is in the dialog label here, which is just the text that is spoken by the character. There is auto wrapping in here. So if you compare it to like Unity or other engines in general, they don't have auto wrapping as far as I know. In terms of Unity, I never figured out how to do that in Unity, at least. Maybe Unity does have it, maybe they have it now that I don't use it anymore, I don't know. But here the option to add auto wrapping is very simple. You just have to go to your label and auto wrap, just click that on, and that's it basically. So now here, as you can see, that didn't update quite well. Maybe if I change that? Oh, no. Okay, so it seems that... Hey, great. You want to say that something is good, and then suddenly there's a bug in here. Yeah, because the label suddenly resized itself. So if I go and... So if I go and do that, you can see it auto wraps quite well. But for some reason, when I toggled auto wrap off, it resized the whole label, which it shouldn't do in my opinion. But that is obviously a bug in Godot, and I hope they fix it soon. Again, there are some minor bugs in Godot. I already mentioned quite a few. as long as you initially set everything up, it is not a problem. You won't happen to see those bugs. But if you want to edit your stuff afterwards, you are very much likely to encounter one of those bugs. So yeah, keep that in mind for the future. Yeah. So that's basically everything for the text box. I don't think it's that difficult to understand, but if there are any questions, just leave them in the comments. Now we have visually a text box here, and we can drop it in just like that into our game right here, and we can use it theoretically. Now we do need a script for that in order to use the text box properly. And obviously I've attached a script to the text box itself, and here I encountered another few problems with Godot, which is in terms of the portraits. Now I want portraits in this game to be I don't want to load them every time from the hard drive. Instead, I want them to be in RAM memory, and yeah, basically swap them out every time the character changes. And that is a bit finicky again in Godot, because you have this export command here, which is used for the fact that you can assign values for variables in your script in the editor. So in my case, I have these two textures here, and I can assign images to these textures. Now I would much rather have it if I could just have an array of textures so that I could iterate on them or directly assign them in a way. Yeah, but that's not really possible at the moment for some reason. At least I wasn't able to figure that out. If you are going and say you want to export an array of textures over portraits, you will get this error message here. And this is the correct syntax for having arrays of something, because I'm already using it in here with nodepath. So that works, but for some reason it doesn't work here. And this is why you have to specify basically every texture that you want to use for the text box as a separate export variable, which is not nice. But that will hopefully change at some point. Yeah, and for some reason I added an S there. I didn't want to do that. So yeah, aside from that, the script itself is relatively simple. What you need to have are some constants for the transition effect, in terms of if you are looking at this UI element, the transition in offset is basically the Y coordinate of the text box when it's fully transitioned in, and the transition out offset is the position of the text box once it's fully transitioned out, so when you leave the game. So right now the text box is at the Y coordinate 400. I haven't deleted it. because this constant deletion of nodes is something that you see a lot of other people's do. It's not necessarily well, I personally think it is a bad thing, because you are if you're constantly spawning and deleting nodes, that takes up quite a lot of memory, and it is work you don't really have to do. You just need to get the UI element out of a viewport. So I personally think you should just go ahead and transition it out in a way that it is out of the screen area, out of the area that is visible to the player. I think that's a far better solution than deleting the nodes every time and reinstantiating them. So that's the solution I went for. But if you want to do this with node deletion and respawning, go ahead. I don't mind, obviously. It's your game then. And yeah, but I don't do it in this tutorial. So yeah, those are those three those two constants, and the third one is the transition speed, which just shows how fast the UI element is transitioned in. Then we have this variable, which is transition offset, and it will have either the value of the in variable or the out variable, so that later on we can calculate by lerping the position, which I go on in a second. We have the lerp value. Again, I'll explain that later, and the transition in variable, which will just decide whether you are in the state of transitioning in or transitioning out the UI element. Now, technically, if we go into the game again, in this case, if it's already fully transitioned in, then even then the script is in the state of, or the variable that we see here, the transition in variable, is in a state of true. We just don't see it because nothing changes so far. But that's something you have to know if you want to expand on this script. Now, that is so much for the variables. The process of transitioning in and out is obviously done in process. And this is done by manipulating the lerp value that we have here. So lerping between different positions and alpha values and that sort of stuff is something that most engines can do. And it's often the case that you have an initial value and a value you want to go to. And you have a lerp value that basically is a value between 0 and 1, which shows you how far along you are from the initial value towards the goal value in a way. So if lerp value is 1, then it will return the goal value, which in this case is this out offset here. And if it is 0, lerp will return this value. And if it's anything in between, it will have the according value in between. So we need this in order to define on every update the new position for the texture UI element, so that it is really fading in, and not fading in, but positioning in and not just popping up. Now the fade effect works in a very similar way. For that we need to access all the child nodes of our texture box, so the sprites and the labels, and we need to apply the lerp value to the alpha value that they have. Because alpha values in Godot are also between 0 and 1, we can just subtract the lerp value from 1 or use the lerp value directly, depending on whether we want to transition in or transition out. So, yeah. We set the alpha value by using the method setModulate, which is probably something that you haven't seen if you aren't familiar with Godot. In most other engines it's more like set color or set alpha or whatever. In this case it's setModulate, and you pass the whole color value along with the alpha value in the back here for the according node. So that's basically how all of this works. So just to reiterate, if we aren't transitioning in, we are transitioning out of this of our current position. So the Textbox UI element fades away. And if that's the case, we want our transition offset, so the new position for the UI element, to be something in between the position when it is fully spawned in and when it's fully spawned out. When it's fully in the viewport and it's fully out of the viewport. So it's something between these values, and we will use the lerp value to manage that. And because we are fading out, we subtract the lerp value from 1, so that if the lerp value gets larger, that more of the modes fade out more. On the other hand, if we are transitioning in, then we do the exact opposite here. The last thing we need to do for process is to actually assign the calculate position now to the actual position of a node, which we do by assigning two positions. For one, the camera position, because we want our UI to always be in the same position of the game and not part of the scene. We want to have it as an overlay. And to that, we add the transition offset as a vector. Now, if we wanted to have something like an X movement also, we would have to add a value in this part too. And that's basically everything for process. Yeah. If now we can, for one, we have defined how the texture, what the texture box looks like, and we have defined how it should spawn into the scene, even though it's not exactly spawning, it's just fading in. Now what is still left to do is how we actually trigger that, and the fact that we still need to input text and a portrait value into the text box for different events in the game. Now the first part, the triggering of this fade-in effect, is done with this function, which just checks whether the transition in variable is equals to the new value, and if that's not the case, then the lerp value is resetted to 0 and the new value is applied to transition in. Now, why do we need this condition in here? We need this condition because otherwise, actually I can show you. Yet let's just delete this variable right here, this condition. And if we go now in here, it seems to work right, but if I press it multiple times, you see it will always fade in, and that's something we don't want to have. So that's why we need this condition right here in order for the text box to stay in here just at the position that it's already faded in. Okay, and this method we can use in our other scripts to trigger this sort of effect. So if we go to interaction object, which is the script I'm currently using to show off this feature, we can go to, in my case, process, check if the player node is inside the collision area, and if that's the case, we get the node for the text box that is already in the scene. We set the dialog, which we'll talk about in just a moment, and we set transition in to true, so that it is transitioning in the text box, that is. Now, if we want to transition out when we are leaving, we use the onBodyExit method and just call, under the same circumstances, that is the case that the object that is going out of the collision area is the player, then we'll call transition in out with false, so it is transitioning out then. Now this method is this method will be called automatically whenever something leaves the according collision area, and the according collision area is that blue thing here. And the reason why that is called is because we connected it on the ready method. So we said, okay, in the case that the body exited event is thrown, we want to automatically call this method here, which is that one. And this event is called every time that a kinetic body, I think is the name for it, is kinematic body 2D, every time that a kinetic body 2D is leaving the collision area. So it could also be called for other kinematic bodies, if we have others in the game. So that is why we need to make sure that the body that actually left is the player. And that is why we have this condition here with getName equals player name. So yeah, so that is how we trigger everything. Now the last thing that I want to discuss here is how we set up a dialog, and that is quite simple in fact. All we need to do is access the according child nodes, which we can do with this $ and the according name for the child. And in case of the labels, we just call text and assign the new variable to it. And in terms of the portrait index, we have to use this not so elegant if-else-if statement here to properly assign it, because again, as I mentioned earlier, we can't use arrays at the moment for textures. So we can't just say, okay, use whatever, use the texture at the array position of portrait index. We can't do that. And we also can't use switches, which is also, not really nice. I mean, You don't need switches, technically, because an if-else-if statement block is just the same as a switch block. But yeah, it would be nice if you had that syntax sugar in your code, if you could use that, but maybe at a later point. So yeah, that's why we have this if-else-if statement here. So if portrait index is 0, we use the texture 0 texture for the portrait, and otherwise we use the 1. So yeah, I think that's everything for this feature. The tutorial is already quite long, I'm sorry for that. But yeah, I hope you found it useful, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I know it is quite, it can be quite complicated to follow everything. And honestly, it was also a little bit of a hassle to implement, because of all the things that you have to consider that aren't really working right now or aren't yet implemented and or are buggy in a way. But I think overall the engine is still quite useful, and I still enjoy working with it. It's just that, yeah, I would like to have these few features in there, then it would be even better. So yeah, I think that's it for today. So until next time, bye bye.